Hey, this is Art from My New Microphone. We all know how important compression is in mixing and music production, and today I'd like to share with you 11 tips to make better use of compression in your mixes. Let's dive right in. Tip number 1 is to always A/B test our compressors and to ensure that we are using proper makeup gain. By A/B testing, I'm referring to turning the compressor on and off and listening as objectively as we possibly can to whether or not the compressor is actually improving the mix or not improving the mix. It's important when A/B testing to do so in the context of a mix. It's one thing to turn the compressor on and off and listen to a single track in solo, but another to listen to it in the greater context of the mix. After all, mixing is about combining several elements together in a cohesive piece, and so A/B testing our compression in the context of the mix is the best way to do so. It's also essential that we set up proper makeup gain for our compressors, especially when A/B testing. Makeup gain, as the name would suggest, is gain applied after compression to make up what was taken away during the gain reduction stage of the compressor. Setting the compressor's makeup gain so that the track is at the same loudness whether the compressor is turned on or off helps us when A/B testing by ridding of the loudness bias, where we often prefer the louder option of the two. Furthermore, by setting the makeup gain appropriately, we can maintain our proper gain staging throughout the signal chain, which makes mixing much easier. Tip number 2 is to set the compressor release time to the rhythm of the song, especially with transient material. The release time of a compressor is the rate of change or time it takes for the compressor to completely disengage once the signal feeding the compressor's gain reduction circuit falls below the set threshold. We can set the compressor release time so that it disengages right before the following transient. This can reduce pumping and also allow the track to breathe, maintaining a good amount of compression while also allowing the transients to poke through and re-trigger the compressor when they do. Tip 3 is to use attack times to allow the perfect amount of transient information to poke through before the compressor begins engaging. Like the previous tip, this is especially useful on transient information and helps us to actually shape the transients of specific tracks. It's fairly common on snare drum tracks to dial in the proper attack time of a compressor to help shape the transient and help the snare drum poke through the mix. Shorter attack times will allow the compressor to clamp down on the transients faster and allows us more control over such transients. Longer attack times will allow some of the transient information to poke through and can even have the effect of increasing the dynamic range of the track in question. As an aside, altering the attack and release times of a compressor can help us to shape the transients and the sustain of whatever track we are working on. Tip number 4 is to know the genre you are working with and the general mix aesthetic that is expected of such a genre. Listen to references in the same or similar genres as the mix you are working on and ask yourself what the typical amount of compression ought to be for a mix before going too deep into compressing. Are you working on jazz or classical music, which often has little to no compression? Or on the other end, are you working on EDM or pop music, which is often very compressed? Knowing the genre and the typical compression trends of such a genre can help you make more informed decisions in your own mix. Tip number 5 is not to be afraid of fader or volume automation post-compression. This is particularly useful with vocals, which are often the most dynamic tracks in any given mix. Rather than relying entirely on compression to control the dynamics of our track, whether it's a vocal or otherwise, we can opt to automate the fader or a gain plugin post-compression to really hone in and have fine-tuned control over the dynamics. Relying too much on compression, especially if we really want to squash the dynamics, can lead to overcompression and a lifeless vocal or other track. Tip 6 is that not everything needs compression. Although compressors are invaluable tools in the mixing engineer's toolbox, they are not always necessary or warranted on our tracks or our mixes as a whole. Without dynamics, music would be lifeless and boring, and so squashing dynamics too much in our mix can lead to similar poor results. In addition to what we discussed in tip 4 about genres and typical mix aesthetics, we should also understand compression at the individual track level. Distortion or any other effect that helps to shape a audio waveform toward that of a square wave will cause distortion and compression. And so compression isn't always necessary on these tracks. Some sources and instruments maintain very stable levels across the board, things like synthesizers or pads, and these sources may not warrant compression either. Finally, Because dynamics are so important in music, it's often the case that a musician will really hone in and dial in the dynamics of their performance, in which case compression may ruin or otherwise undermine such a great performance. So not everything needs compression, and unnecessary compression can quickly suck the life out of a mix. So just be aware of that. Tip number 7 is to consider top-down mixing, starting with the mix bus. With top-down mixing, we are starting at the very top broad level mix bus and processing that before moving on to the individual instrument groups and buses and processing those, and finally getting down to the individual tracks. This top-down approach often allows us to use less processors and plugins as we are affecting multiple instruments together in their bus, or multiple buses and instruments together at the mix bus. Compression often has the effect of helping to glue individual elements together at the bus level, and so a top-down approach is often a great way to start compressing in the mix. Once the initial mix is set with proper headroom, we can go ahead and apply a mix bus compressor and mix into that. Taking one step down from the mix bus, we can apply compression to each of the instrument buses to control the dynamics of the individual instruments that are being fed into these buses. It can be much more efficient to compress this way by inserting 1 or 2 compressors on each bus rather than on each individual track, although we also have the option to go through and compress an individual track if need be. So the big advantage of compression through a top-down approach is we use fewer compressor processors or plugins throughout the entire mix. And we also have the benefit of better glue and cohesion in the mix at the bus level and the mix bus level, rather than applying individual compressors to each track, each with its own settings. Of course, I will mention it again that we can certainly go into the individual tracks and compress them individually. However, we do not have to rely on a compressor on each and every individual track in order to control the dynamic range of the tracks in the mix. Tip number 8 is serial compression. Serial compression, as the name suggests, is stacking multiple compressors together in series, having an audio signal run through one compressor before hitting another, and so on and so forth. Serial compression could mean having multiple compressors on an individual track or bus, and it could also mean having a compressor on a track that feeds into a bus that is also being compressed, that feeds into another bus, say the mix bus, which also has a compressor inserted. A huge advantage of serial compression is that each compressor stacked in series shares the load of controlling the dynamics of the audio signal. A set amount of gain reduction by a single compressor may sound unnatural and overcompressed. However, if we were to use multiple compressors in series, we could likely achieve that same amount of gain reduction in a much more natural way, since each compressor is working a lot less hard than that single compressor. In using serial compression, we can sound more natural and shave off more dynamics, ultimately leading to a higher potential for mix loudness. An additional benefit of serial compression is that we get to mix and match the different inherent sonic characteristics of whatever compressors we choose to use in series. These sonic characteristics bring us to tip number 9 when using compression, and that is using compression for coloration, even if we don't apply any gain reduction whatsoever. Many compressors have inherent sonic characteristics, especially hardware units and those plugins that emulate hardware units. Simply running our audio signals through these compressors can give us a nice coloration for the mix, whether we apply any gain reduction or not. Tip number 10 is utilizing parallel compression. Parallel compression, in contrast to serial compression, actually splits an audio signal and compresses one version of that signal before summing them back together. Parallel compression is typically achieved by sending a track or a bus to an effects return bus and heavily compressing that return track. However, some compressor plugins have a wet-dry control, which effectively acts the same way for parallel compression. In this case, the amount of dry signal that is let through is analogous to the original track, and the amount of wet signal that is let through is analogous to the effects return. By heavily compressing the effect return channel, we get a heavily squashed version of the signal that we can then mix back into the mix. By pushing the fader of the effect return channel up, we effectively get a style of upward compression where the dynamic range is reduced, not by bringing down the top peak level of the track, but rather by increasing the lowest level of the track. Parallel compression is very effective on drum bus and vocals to help thicken up these tracks and make them more present and punchy in the mix. Although many digital audio workstations do a fantastic job of compensating for any plugin delay, it may be worth inserting the same compressor on the original track or bus as is inserted on the parallel bus, even if the compressor isn't actually applying any gain reduction on the original track or bus. This way, we can be safe even if there is a little bit of delay from the plugins, that each of these tracks will be in phase with each other. We don't want any delay between the original track or bus and the parallel compressed return channel, because this would cause phase issues and potential comb filtering, which could be very detrimental to the mix. Finally, tip 11 is using sidechain compression. Now, the sidechain of a compressor is simply the signal that is feeding the gain reduction circuit. Oftentimes, this sidechain is the input or the program signal, or the audio being fed into the compressor, but it can also be an external audio signal as well, if the compressor allows for it. We can get a lot of cool effects and control by utilizing an external signal as a compressor's sidechain that will act to duck the program signal running through the compressor. Using sidechain compression with an external sidechain signal can be super effective for reducing frequency masking and helping improve separation between elements in a mix. A great example of this is utilizing the kick drum signal to affect the compression of a bass guitar, so that whenever the kick drum is present in the mix, it will bring down the level of the bass guitar and then bring the level of the bass guitar back up when the kick is not present in the mix. Doing this can help push the kick through the mix when it's present without overly affecting the overall level of the bass guitar. Another example of using sidechain compression to reduce frequency masking is taking a vocal and using that to control the compressor of, say, an acoustic guitar, electric guitar, or piano, or anything else that may be interfering with the vocal. By compressing only 1 or 2 dB, we can really make space for the vocal when it's present, and then have the other instrument come up when the vocal is not present. Another common technique with sidechain compression is rhythmic pulsing, where we will take a transient source like a kick drum and use it to really duck a other instrument or a bus of instruments. You can often hear this in electronic dance music, where the kick drum is really punching through and ducking everything else when it is present. But this rhythmic pulsing technique can also be used more subtly in percussion loops. Say we have a shaker, we can use the snare drum, say, to control the compressor of the shaker, just to give it a little bit more movement and breath and rhythm in the mix. So there you have it, 11 tips to make better use of compression in your mixes. If you found this video helpful and valuable, I would invite you to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel if you would like to see more content. We're just getting started here at the My New Microphone YouTube channel, and I'm very thankful to have you here with me. I would also like to point you to the description box below to check out all of the additional resources I have for you, including my Mixing with Compression ebook, which dives into compression in great detail to give you the ins and outs of the processor and how it's used in mixing. I also have a Mixing with Me video course training where I go through start to finish mixing a song, and we focus quite a bit on compression in that video training as well. I will also put up a few videos I think you will also enjoy watching here on YouTube. I want to wish you all the best in all of your music and mixing endeavors, and I will see you in the next one.